topic today is שאינו יודע, בטיב גיטין וקידושין לא יהא לו עסק עמהם. The importance of proficiency in order to be a Mesader get, and this is said alongside the din that you have to be proficient when it comes to being apparently a Mesader Kiddushin as well. So we have to figure out the application of this statement in terms of what many are currently training to eventually be. If you learn Hilchos Gittin as part of Yodin Kollel, Yitachen, that someday you might be a dayan bedover, to have to be Mesader Gittin, and it's important to know exactly what the qualifications are. So this din that you need to be יודע, בטיב, גיטין וקידושין is found in a couple of places in Maseches Kiddushin, Daf Vav and Daf Yud Gimel, and it starts off with the principle that you need to know halachos that are shchichos. And the specific halacha that's mentioned is hayamidab ma'isha liskei gita v'kidushah v'nasan la gita v'kidushah v'lo pirish Rabbi Yossi Omer Dayo, that if a person is asukin be'osuinyan, speaking to his wife or somebody whom he wants to be his wife, about either divorcing his current wife or getting married to the woman he wants to marry, and then he gives either a get to his wife or gives a tabas for the sake of Kiddushin to his prospective wife, and they accept it. So Rabbi Yossi says this is a perfectly valid get, this is a perfectly valid Kiddushin, in contrast to Rabbi Yehuda says otherwise, and Amar Rav Huna Mashmuel says the halacha is Rabbi Yossi. So it is specifically in that context in which Rabbi Yemer says to Rav Ashi, so this statement that Rabbi Yehuda Mashmuel makes that you should not be involved in Gittin and Kiddushin if you don't know the halachos, does that mean even this halacha, this pikiyun halacha about a sukin be'oso inyan, that this could count? Even if a person went through all of Hilchos Gittin and didn't necessarily come across this specific inyan or missed it, would he still be disqualified from being involved with the Gittin and Kiddushin? So Amalei, so answered Rav Ashi, he said that in Achinami, yes, this is in fact true, that even this would be something that needs to be known. Now, Rashi says that when we say one shouldn't be involved, he uses an interesting term, which is relevant halacha l'maisa, both in the realm of Gittin and Kiddushin. He says, Leo's dayan bedover, indicating that there's some sort of a maisa bezdin involved with being involved with Gittin and Kiddushin. Maybe like a dayan can't be a karov, so you shouldn't be a karov even if you're a Mesader Kiddushin. Just like a dayan who does a maisa bezdin has to be during the daytime, so maybe you shouldn't do it at night. There's an orzarua along those lines, not to do a get at night. And we are generally machmeh, at least lechatchila, in the realm of Gittin, that we don't do Gittin at night lechatchila, although there were Rabbanim who were comfortable doing it even lechatchila at night because they were too busy during the daytime. We're not getting into that particular sugya, where the Noda Yehuda says it's more me'ikar din if it's going to be ayidei shliach, because you have to say b'fanei nektar, which is like a kiyum chasimos, which has to be a ma'aseh bezdin that's only done during the daytime. But Rashi indicates that there is some type of role of dayanus that is involved in the administration of Gittin and Kiddushin, which is a good basis for us that even though Yodin would seem to be in the realm of Chol Shemishpat, that we see from here that Even Ezer also qualifies in terms of dayanus, in terms of Yodin, Leo's dayan bedover. And what are we concerned about, says Rashi, that we're worried about Meuvaslo Yuchal Iskon, that Shema Yatir Yisareva, that if you don't know the rules properly, you may come to make a mistake and say that something is permissible, that a woman is a grusha, when in fact she's still an Eishes Ish, etc. Or you might have a woman who's a surah for other reasons. You might come to be matir, a grusha, lakohen, or who knows what, various things that you might do. But most seriously, an Isser Erva, like an Isser Eishes Ish, you might come to permit and that's going to be, especially in the context of an Isser Eva, could lead to Mamzerus, and that, of course, will be a Muvas Lo Yuchal Liskon. Now, Rashi says that the criterion is whether even a Pikiyun law of this sort, of Asukim Be'osuinyan, is shchicha enough, it happens commonly enough, that if a person didn't know it, then they might make a mistake in hara. So Rashi says that was the question. Klor mi shchicha. Is this considered to be shchicha, that a person is going to give a get or a kiddushin or a tabas to a woman and is not going to spell it out? And presumably then, the answer in the Gemara is that in fact it is shchicha in achinami. Has anybody here ever seen anything like that? Typically, when you're Mesader Kiddushin, it's not just an asukim b'osuinyan. It's the chassan says harei mikudeshesli. It's not just they're schmoozing with each other at the badekin, and then the chassan says to Kala, "Hey, why wait? Let's get married right now." Some say the badekin counts as like, and he's suing anyway, so I may as well give you the ring. He drops it into her hands, So I don't think we've ever seen that happen. Yes, Mordechai.
Because they say
I hear a swipe at Ashkenazim here.
They say tabas zu kadas Moshe, which means the ring that, like the laws of Moses in Israel, not this ring. And now it leaves Seif Aleph of Siman Lamed Chav Zayin and goes to Seif Aleph Asukim Indian. Literally every Ashkenazi wedding is like that.
That might be more like Yadayim Mochichos, I think, when they say tabas zu instead of tabas zo. Though a lot of people say tabas zo as well.
It can happen if the Adam don't hear the words said. He doesn't say it loud enough. That happens.
So from his perspective, he wasn't just Asukim B'Yosuiyim, but from the Adam, from the perspective of the Adam. It does happen the Adam don't hear things so perfectly. Sometimes they don't even see things so perfectly. And that's
talk low. We tell them say loud.
So I saw B'Didi Havavda with a get. I was involved in a Din Torah once with Rabbi Leibish Landesman and Rabbi Reuven Alt.
Wow.
And we were adjudicating the case in Muncie, and it was a very difficult husband who was a gruff and rough personality, and the wife was a little bit of a flighty personality. It was a perfect shidduch, but somehow they decided to get divorced anyway. And on the spot, I remember it was a full all-star crew. We had Gershon Spiegel as the Tohen for the husband, and it was very labadic. And we finally reached a determination of how to allocate all the finances, everything like that. And I was asked to write it up in nice legalese language, and I wrote the whole thing up in longhand. I remember on the spot, before everybody had computers and laptops, so I wrote the whole thing up in longhand. And it was signed by everyone, and then we decided we're going to do the get on the spot. There was a machlokes at the beginning, whether to do the get up front or at the end. Finally, we had an agreement that was signed. The husband was not happy about what the Bezdin decided. He didn't get as much money as he thought he was entitled to. But the wife's father was the most meticulous man I have seen in history in terms of keeping track of every single expense and invoice of exactly what went into the marriage and who paid for what, and how. It was unbelievable, the records that this guy had. So it was really almost irrefutable. But the husband was really annoyed and fed up, and he was one of these personalities. He was a flight risk. We really worried about an Aguna situation. The get was written up. I remember that Rabbi Lichter came in, and he drove into Muncie. And, he lived in Muncie, so he drove into the Rabbi Landesman's office where we were holding it. And what? Rabbi Elia Lichter. Yeah, Rabbi Elia Lichter. And I think it was Rabbi Elia Lichter. And it may have been Rabbi Yankee Lichter, but I don't know why it would have been him, given that it was in Muncie. So that detail I don't remember 100%. But anyway, the get was completed, and we were telling the husband what to do and continuing to ask the question. He was getting really fed up, and he needed to go. He said, I have a flight to catch, whatever. And finally, we're discussing everything, and we're at the moment in which he's supposed to give over the get to his wife. And he takes the get, and he just flings it into her hand, and he runs out the door. We're looking at each other. He said, that's it. The din of Rabbi Yossi. Halacha Rabbi Yossi. So nobody even paused for a moment. He said, Halacha Rabbi Yossi. Asuka Me'osavinian. We wrote the Patur. Finished it right there. Wow. You gotta know. You gotta know what to do. So is it shchiach? Well, it happened. Maybe it only has to happen once every 28 years or so, but Lamaisa, this happened. Now, Tosos writes that if you have a person who is knowledgeable with respect to Hilchos, Gittin, and Kiddushin, so you have to notify that person. Sarach lahodio had Rav Yehuda mashmosh lo yikasha ba d'shchicha. That a person needs to know this, because otherwise you can really mess somebody up. In that case, if we wouldn't know the halacha and we would say, oh, we have to worry for we need an actual amira, that maybe we would never have gotten the husband back, and you make a woman into an aguna. But it could also work in the opposite situation. If you're convinced that it's not a good get, and then somebody else gives a kiddushin, she's kibla kiddushin me'acher, and you say, oh, she doesn't need anything, it's garnished, it's meaningless because she's still married to the other fellow, so you're also going to be matir ish lialma on both directions. So it's always going to be, every single halacha is going to be a double-edged sword, and that's what Tosfos Dibur HaMaskil Lo Yehei says, basically that it's a double-edged sword. He also brings another shita, which is not the one that's accepted la halacha, but it's kind of an interesting thing, like good advice that you should give to anybody who's in shidduchim. Good advice to anybody in shidduchim, that if you have a serious relationship, shelo yidabim anoshim aliske kiddushin lekadsham, shepamim mishetei mekudeshes b'amirasam v'nisinasam lo yavin mekashe lo yavin, that you might have a situation in which you have a couple that's going out seriously. If they spend too much, if they speak too intensely about actually, getting married, about the Ma'aseh Kiddushin, and in the context of speaking about, oh, we're going to get married this way, that way, I'm going to give you a ring, and and by the way, here, and then he drops a ring into her hands. So then you could have a serious shayla. So that's also something to be mindful about. But primarily, we're speaking about those who are training in this area, as Rashi says, who are going to be a dayan bedover. So I'm thinking, what does shchicha mean in this context? When we speak about, for example, how dayanim nowadays have authority to adjudicate various matters that require a real bezdin samuch, like, for example, being kofer al Gittin, the sugya Gittin taf peiches amud beis, where Abaye asked Rav Yosef, how is it that we're kofer nowadays? And he says, oh, that's okay, shlichusayel kavdinon. That we're doing the shlichus of, they were in Bavel of those who are in Eretz Yisrael. We say, Tosfos points out, nowadays you don't even have dayanim who are smuchim in Eretz Yisrael. How do we do it? So he says, shlichusayah the kamai kavdinon, and the Tzos says, that's, before Tosfos asked the kasha, that's pshat, even in the days of Abaye Rav Yosef, you didn't necessarily have smuchim in Eretz Yisrael. So he says that was also relying on shlichusayah the kamai kavdinon, that we require a bezdin with respect to matters of kfiyah. So even when it comes to things of that variety, we have a general principle. When is it that we say shlichusayu? So the Gemara in Baba Kama says you need a milsa de shchicha v'yesh bo chisar and kiss. So the Rishonim asked, so is this shchicha? Even if Gittin are shchiach, so it is cases where you're ma'aseh gitti, where you're going to be kofen ala get, is that going to be shchiach? So it could be it's more shchiach than we realize, but it's also possible, as some of the poskim say, that because of, some of the Rishonim say this, because of the significance of seeing to it that we have proper Gittin, that we have proper protocols to be able to administer Gittin, even in cases of kfiyah that will be necessary, despite the fact that there may be few and far between, the importance of the union makes it into shchiach. So too you can argue that that's what shchiach means, and that's what the question was. Do we say that shchiach is a question of mitzius? Is it really shchiach? And that's what Rav Yehuda was asking Rav Ashi. Maybe this isn't really shchiach, so the dayan doesn't have to know this. Rav Ashi was answering, no, it's not a question of mitzius. It's a question of chashivus. That because of the fact that it could come up once in 28 years, this Ma'aseh that I'm describing is probably from 28 years ago, even once in 28 years, because of the importance of the union, that's also considered to be shchiach in the context of Gittin. So that's a chiddush number one that I wanted to suggest. Now, from the Tosos, that's not the one that I have printed, it's the other Tosos on the top, that talks about this person who's nismane al Gittin. So it sounds, and even from the Lashon of Rashi, who speaks about a dayan for Gittin, so it sounds like this is something which is a specific appointment that is required. Where do we find such a thing, that I need a specific appointment of somebody who's going to be Mesader Gittin? So that's on the Sugya in Mesachas Gittin and Daf Hey and Beis. That speaks about a barhedya, somebody who wanted to be a shliach, to bring a get from location A to location B. The husband authorizes the get in location A, has to bring the get to location B. Serve as a shliach, lasuya gitta. So also the kamei de Rabbi Achi. So he came in front of Rabbi Achi. Rabbi Achi was what, according to the Gemara? Says he was the Have Mamuna Agiti. He was the person who was specifically appointed to be in charge of Gittin. I mean, it's a funny story because you figure this is the one place the Gemara speaks about, a personality who's appointed to be in charge of Gittin. You wouldn't want to ruin it with like a story where he actually didn't know the halacha, but that's the story. The story is that he told this Barhedya, you have to stand over every single os for os. As a shliach, you got to watch every letter that's written. And I think Rabbi Yami said to him, what are you talking about? You're being motzi laz on the Gittin Arishonim. We never required such a thing. One of the rules of Hilchos Gittin is not to be motzi laz. And a shliach only has to be there during the writing of the first line. Takes a siman to remember, to make sure that this is the correct get when he comes back afterwards. You don't have to stand there. Anybody who's going to do it as a chumrah is going to be motzi laz. If the shliach doesn't have anything else to do and he just wants to stand, to sit around because he enjoys watching the sofa write the get, that's 100% permissible. But to do it out chumrah, so that you're not supposed to do. But anyway, we see from the story that he was mamuna agiti, and this is this idea that you should have somebody who's specifically qualified is mentioned in the Seder Aget. You look at the after Siman Kuf Nun Daled, the Seder Aget is written. It's the very first sif in the Seder Aget. It's the very last sif in the Seder Aget, to have people who are specifically trained for this purpose. But it's more than that, that it has to be somebody who's niskabil. When we want to have a recognized Mesader Get, somebody who's, there aren't so many throughout all of North America who are recognized as Mesader Gittin. It's a process by which those who are the existing respected Mesader Gittin evaluate whether they want to vouch for somebody in particular, and if they do, they write a letter to the major rabbinic bodies all over the world, particularly in Eretz Yisrael, the Rabbanut in Eretz Yisrael, say we hereby are vouching for the following individual. The idea that you have is what happens sometimes in various communities, that a person just suddenly puts on a letterhead that they are a Rav Mesader Gittin, and they start doing it on their own. They find a sofer to work with them. Very, very problematic, and in fact is considered to be a severe offense, because you saw what Rashi wrote, that it's muvaslo yishol yuchal iskon. It could end up creating problems of mamzeris in Klal Yisrael. There were some rabbis who figured out a great solution. Instead of being Mesader Gittin, we'll just be matzir all the women without a get. Doesn't say anywhere, right, that we have to, be trained in order to do that. We're not going to be Mesader a get. We'll just be Mesader a heter. So obviously, kavachomer ben menoshe kavachomer, that's much, much more problematic in terms of being matir eishish without a specific appointment. There's one shur by the Ksam Sofer in Chelekei, which is Choshim Mishpat, Simen Kop Samach Beis, that he talks about a Rav who people were complaining about. They were complaining, he had krum hashkafos. And they saw he wasn't doing the tilas yadayim before Sudas. They're complaining. So Sam Sofer said, in terms of hashkafos, everybody passes everybody else if they don't like, their particular orientation. So I don't know that that's not being done out of malice, or how meaningful that is, and who knows the affair, the matters of somebody's heart, right? Halon Mesesa B'Tzel Shakai, only HaKadosh Baruch Hu knows, the shadow. So that I'm not going to passel him. He says in Atilas Yadayim, maybe he forgot, maybe, it's Derabanan, and we can't passel him without Hachraza. We have to look into that a little bit more. But then the third thing, that was the whopper. What was the third thing? Third thing, he said, this is Yaduam Meforsam. He's being Mesader Gittin in a city where there's not a Kvi Hashem, where the Rabbanei Ha'ir have not specifically established that you can write Gittin in this city. They haven't established a particular name for the city. He just on his own, presumptuously, walked into the city and started to be Mesader Gittin without getting any kind of reshus. He says this is the biggest possible avla. Not only is this a terrible avla, says the Chassam Sofer, however, he says that you have to take this person down from his position of authority. Look at source Yud Aleph in the materials. Hashlishi, the third thing that you're complaining about this person, should be Giloi Panim, Sider Beis Gittin, Achash Asur Lav L'Sader Shem Get, where the rabbis of the city said, we're not ready to do Sider Gittin in this city. He says that this is, you don't need Adis for this, for some main Saracharaya. So he says that though it's not enough, he has to be stripped of his position. But he said that's not enough. Not enough to strip him of his position in this community. This is such a cardinal offense. For this, we're going to strip a person of all of his rabbinic authority, that he's no longer going to be considered rabbi. We're going to revoke his smicha. For something like this, says the Chassam Sofer, I didn't give the smicha. I don't care who gave the smicha. This fellow's smicha must be revoked for something like this, because this is the type of offense that can lead to being matir erva and to being mabe mamzerim b'Yisrael, which is basically what the Gemara later on Daf Yud Gimel talks about, that somebody who is going to be involved in Gittin v'kiddushin without the proper training, so he is considered to be worse than the Dor HaMabul. Why is he worse than the Dor HaMabul? The Maharsha says the Dor HaMabul, so they were guilty of arayas, but they were all goyim, so it wasn't going to lead to mamzeris. But once you have Yidden involved, it's going to lead to mamzeris. So therefore, that's going to be much worse. Now Rashi says, going back to the sugya on Daf Yud Gimel. So he talks about that we need to have. Hold on, do I have that in the materials? I'm not sure if I have that in the materials. I'll just say it on the outside. That the importance of being יודע, בטיב, גיטין, וקידושין is also the aruye, is that you're going to have to give hara. So there's a question as to whether we're going to distinguish between a person being a functionary and a person who is going to be giving hara, right? This is the Rashi, on the Sugya and Daf Amud Beis with respect to Rabbi Achi. So he says, in order to give hara. So this is a question, particularly in the realm of Kiddushin. In Gittin, it's very difficult to think about doing a get without there being some hara. I've never been involved in a get where there wasn't some sort of a shaila involved about how to write this shame or that shame, or the circumstances of the get and so forth. But one of the questions that the poskim deal with is, we understand the enormity of Gittin, but why do we lump together Kiddushin? Kiddushin, we know that any recently minted musmach from the yeshiva goes out there in the community and they're immediately asked to be Mesader Kiddushin. It's a very nervous experience and all that, but you don't have to be a Rasha Bahag necessarily to be Mesader Kiddushin. So we'll get to that in a moment, and that I think also opens up some portals into some of the things that we're worried about when it comes to Gittin and the intersection between Gittin and Kiddushin. So the Maharshal on the Sugya of Rabbi Achi points out kind of the obvious, that we see that he didn't necessarily get it right in terms of his chumrus. So says the Maharshal, look at the third line in source Yud Gimel, he says, V'alzeh nispashet hamina ge'ina shechacham ha'ir mesader kol again mitkilasav v'yad sofo. He says you have to be careful who you appoint. You're going to just appoint the Rav Ha'ir who didn't go to the Yodin Kollel and doesn't know Hilchos Gittin. Maybe he's a Yorei Shemayim, but he's just going to be machmir across the board. He says v'takanasa kilkalase. He says that takanasa kilkalasa, that if you're going to just appoint somebody for the sake of appointing somebody, but he's not really qualified, so then that's going to be a kalkola. שאין ממנן חכם בשלמוס החוכמה הצריכה לו, אלא מישהו נסמך ונקרא בשם מורנו החכם המסדר. You just appoint anybody who is the Chacham Meir, and you make him into the Mesader without the requisite training. So then he says that Bein Yoda, Bein Lo Yoda, whether he knows or he doesn't know. So says the Maharshal, if that's the way it's going to be done, I would put an end to this practice. Says the Maharshal, of just appointing whoever happens to be the rabbi of the community to be Mesader Gittin. And therefore he says, if you're going to do it, you better do it correct, because correctly, if you don't do it correctly and you just appoint stam anybody, so then you're going to get into trouble. I think I mentioned the story once. Mordechai did a little video on it about how Weiss, of Yosef Weiss, told me that when in his younger days he used to be Mesader Gittin, he would review mamish all of the Hilchos Gittin mitchilaso ve'ad sofa, in order to ensure that he's going to do it correctly, that you have to have a tremendous bikias, and you have to have a serious chazorah, like the same way that the shochtim are constantly chazering over hilchos gittin, hilchos shkita, several times a year, and I think that the official protocol is every 30 days to go through the simla chadasha, ideally with a Tfuah Shur. If you're a shokay, so look at the She'el Suchuvas Mayim Chayim in source 10, source Yud on page 2, from the sugya of the Mesader Gitti of having a memuna. Chov Gadol Ramni Akor Rabba Memuna L'Sader Gittin Laksor Tomin Al Limudo Val Yismach Al Hergelo Ki Hilchosar Vavivasa Ninu Ve'im Medina Shchita Bedika Tzivu Laksor Limudo Abba Pamim B'Shon at least 4 times a year to go over the Hilchos Shchita for a shochet. So then he says, Kal v'chomer, b'dinei Gittin she'ashkaga mehem mevili dei mamzer esokman al-etzlan, v'od tzarach haram mesad lizar shal binasa ha'yishayin. Right, every single suffix that he has to do shua b'rov yoetz. He has to consult with all of the other rabbanim, unless he says that there's nobody else to consult with, like me here in Algeria, where unfortunately he says I have absolutely nobody whatsoever to consult with. But therefore he says, as a result, I have to follow the rules. That if it is a suffix, only if it's a barar kashemesh lahakalam I makel, but otherwise if it's a suffix I have to be machmir, but that's not the way that you really want to be able to operate. So you should always have a full-fledged crew of Mesadrin who are knowledgeable at the Chicago Rabbinical Council. We always make sure to have multiple Mesadrin, ideally at every single get, because we have at least 2 Mesadrin at every single get. Most Bati did. I don't think I have the luxury of doing that, but with very rare exception, we have myself and Rabbi Rocco both trained Mesadrim at every single get, and we're in the process of training somebody else to be a Mesader as well. But there are occasions when I've been called in where there was a concern that somebody was being Mesader Gittin who didn't have the requisite appointment. Rav Nata Greenblatt called me more than once about a concern he had regarding somebody who was a tremendous Talmid Chacham, but he wasn't specifically vetted to be Mesader Gittin. He was vetted for other roles, but not to be Mesader Gittin. He saw that this individual made up a letterhead and started being Mesader Gittin on his own, and he called me to complain. Even though the person happened to be a big Talmid Chacham, he said this was not an individual who was specifically approved to be a Mesader Get. They took this very, very seriously. I had a situation where in a certain community there was a Rav who was previously a Mesader Gittin, and then the son who had seen his father do it just started doing it on his own. But the Rabbanim of the community called me up and they said, is this the protocol? Or do we have to go through some sort of a process? And I said, you bet. You have to go through some sort of a process. It's not something that you could just do. You could just do automatically. I had another situation where I'm dealing with right now. There are no bad players here, but there's a community that doesn't have a Vada Rabbanim. It's a growing community, and God willing, they'll put together a Vada Rabbanim because they recognize that nature abhors a vacuum. And there was some Bezdin, an out-of-town Bezdin, that saw there's a vacuum. They don't have a Vad. There's nobody there running the show. They need to do Gittin. A lot of communities right now, if there's no official Vad and there's no official Bezdin, so they send around there's a recognized Mesader get who travels, like Rav Nata Greenblatt used to travel from place to place. Now, Rav Mendel Senderovich Shlita travels from place to place and does Gittin, that's perfectly fine. But one of the Bati did a very fine Bezdin. I'm not insulting anybody. A very fine Bezdin wrote a letter saying, we trained somebody in our Bezdin. We think he's a good fellow. He's never been a Mesader Gittin for us necessarily, but he trained in our Bezdin. We're hereby appointing him as the Mesader Gittin for this city. He's going to go to this city and start being Mesader Gittin. So some of the Rabbanim in this city said, okay, fine. So we're happy to work with him. We need Gittin every once in a while. And he's writing Gittin. The other Rabbanim say, we don't know this fellow. He doesn't, I'm sure he's a very fine person, whatever, but he doesn't have a reputation beforehand for being a Mesader Gittin. Why should we rely upon this letter? And they're calling me to figure out what to do. I'll have to speak to Rabbi Willig about this. This is a running issue. By contrast, there's a certain Rav in California who decided he wanted to be a Mesader Gittin, that he's been learning the sugyos and it's important to him and so forth, and he was constantly doing shimush, going around all the Batei Din, so he can sit there and people could get a sense of who he is and so forth, and writing his notes and consulting with respect to questions, and would never dare to raise up his finger to take a quill and to start, writing a get and being Mesader the get on his own, without finally getting the bracha of the Batei Din that he's been consulting with. And he wrote a nice little sefer of some of the Inyani Gittin that he'd been studying. And he wrote to myself, he wrote to Rabbi Zilberman, others who have been working with him, about whether we would endorse him. And we said, look, we have to have a consensus of different Rabbanim, but we can certainly say you're Yorei Shemayim and so forth. And every now and then he was so careful in terms of not overstepping his bounds or doing anything without permission, that now the Rabbinical Council of California calls upon him sometimes to help when they have to do a kisvu tenu or something like that, that he's earning trust over time. He's doing it the right way. There's a right way of doing it, and then there's a more problematic way of doing it. I think he's a sofer too. I'm being very careful not to mention any names over here of anything. I say, yeah, right. But these are real life. These are real life issues. These are real life issues. Now, as I mentioned before, the Sugya and Daf Yud Gimel brings this very interestingly in connection with the Petira of Rabbi Yassi. Rabbi Yassi passed away. The Talmidim said there are certain teachings that we have to go over with each other to make sure that they're not forgotten. And this was one of the teachings. One of the teachings was how important an inyan it is that She'eino יודע בטיב גיטין וקידושין לא יהיה לו עסק עמהם. And Rashi there writes, Koshim li'olam dayanim amorim horos ba'arayas ve'enim b'kiyam yosim midor hamabel the tzarach b'kiyus rav, this idea that we were mentioning with respect to Dor Mabel. So here, the Maharsha in that sugya asks the question, which comes first, Kiddushin or Gittin, chicken or the egg? So he says, Kiddushin, as we know, comes before Gittin. So why does it say, Kol she'eino יודע בטיב גיטין וקידושין לא יהיה לו עסק עמהם? It gives three answers. First answer is, well, you can ask the same kasha about the order of the Masechtos, right? The order of Masechtos, which comes first, Gittin and Kiddushin. Since Gittin comes first, that's why the sugya mentions Gittin first. Second answer is, like the Rambam says, that Mitam b'yotza v'haisa, that since the b'yotza comes first in the pasuk, so that's why we have Gittin before we have Kiddushin. And maybe the idea is that Gittin shouldn't be depressing; it should be forward-looking. That we give a get so a person can go on to a new marriage. We know all of the machshava on the subject. But then he gives the third answer, which is the most germane for our purposes, which is, he says, look, when it comes to Kiddushin, so that is not so hard for people to know on their own, right? If we just be talking about Kiddushin in a vacuum. He says to take a woman who's a penuya and to make her into an Ashes Ish, so she be muteres to her husband. That's a davakal to go from a penuya to an Ashes Ish. What do? She drops a ring. He drops a ring into her hands. You have some sheva brachos. You drink some wine. Not so hard, right? So he says that for that reason, nishtabe v'minig b'dorenu shenosne v'shus l'kol adam hayodea k'tzas la'asok b'kiddushin. That's why anybody who knows anything, they have they're wet behind the ears. Right after smicha, we let them be the Mesader Kiddushin, And the Taz says the same thing. That's why he says the emphasis is on, as we mentioned, the word horos, the horos. So he says there's not much of a hora that you have to do when it comes to Kiddushin. Not everybody agrees. Not everybody agrees. But anyway, that's what they say. As opposed to Gittin, where you have many halachos, you have chomer eishes ish, that you're going to permit an eishes ish li'alma. Much harder to make an eishes ish into a penuya than to make a penuya into an eishes ish. So he says, so when is it that we're worried about expertise in the area of Kiddushin? When it's Kiddushin, that follows Gittin. She'ino יודע, בטיב Gittin וקידושין, לא יהיה לו עסק עמהן. A Kiddushin following a get. Oh, for that you need expertise. A person was divorced, and you need to determine whether the get that they received was a proper get. This is not for the uninitiated. This requires very careful knowledge, and you can end up making terrible mistakes in both directions if you think that a get was good and you're going to act upon it, or you think that a get wasn't good, and then the husband dies, and there's a question as to whether she can go back to her previous, whether she's an almana or a grusha. In this particular case, as to whether she's going to be muteris l'kohen because she's only an almana and she's not a grusha, or whether I'm going to be allow the person, if she remarries afterwards, he can be with her again, whether it's a situation of maxir grushaso or not. So you're going to have all kinds of consequences in both directions, whether you think that a get is good or whether you think that a get is not good. You'll say she was mizanin with somebody else, so maxir grushaso is not going to happen because she'll be asura because she's a mizanin. Or let's say she became the kudeshes to somebody else in the interim, and then she received a get, and you think that the get was not good, and then the husband died. So then in this particular case, if you say the kiddushin, if you say the kiddushin was not good, and all that she had was a kiddushin, so then I have a real shaila as to, I think am I allowed to say about the shaila that's being dealt with right now as to whether a certain get was a valid get because it was potentially a get meusa, Rabbi Willig? Okay. Sometimes the shaila comes up whether a get is valid because it was a get meusa, and then the husband dies afterwards, and there's a question whether this woman is allowed to marry a kohen because she's really an almana as opposed to as a grusha. So that's where we're talking about over here. We're talking about if there is a kiddushin that follows a get, so that requires a tremendous amount of expertise, and that's where we have this question. Now, the Piskei Tshuva quotes from the Shvus Yaakov that takes a different position from the Taz, a different position from the Maharsha, where the Shvus Yaakov says that no, even with respect to performing a Kiddushin of a Penuya, you have a shilos where you need to know that you're not allowed to perform a wedding for certain people, like Shnios Larayos. Not everybody knows Shnios Larayos. Not everybody knows the dinim of Muberis, and Minika, that she's not allowed to get married. A Muberis Minika has to wait 24 months, etc. So he says that even when it comes to the initial marriage, you require some more expertise. But we all know that when it comes to Kiddushin, we're less meticulous, and therefore the Maharsha's point is very well taken that you need particular expertise if you're examining a Kiddushin that follows a get. Now there is in fact a practice that we have that there are certain rabbanim whose gittin are not respected. Number one, there are rabbanim who have a reputation that they do kafiyah on a regular basis. We've had that in the Bezdin. We had that in the Bezdin of America. I remember that whenever we would get a patur from a particular rav, we didn't automatically assume that the get was no good, but we had to do a very careful drisha v'chakira to see to it that he didn't do physical coercion of the husband, because unfortunately this rav had a reputation. He had a reputation. Let's just put it that way. So our sofer would very often write with him, so we were able to go to our sofer and say, did you write? He wouldn't write a get that he thought was going to be a puzzle a get. We said, did you write this get? And did you know the circumstances were such that there was no isoi? but if you don't know, you're not an insider, then you might just come to accept every single get, even when it might be becheskas, Reiss. There's a Reiss. There's I wouldn't say a cheskas psul, but a cheskas shaila, that chazaka, that there's a suffix with respect to every single get that a certain rabbanim did.
You don't tell such person suffering Gittin?
What?
You don't just tell such person suffering Gittin? It's case by case?
We don't have the ability to stop certain people from writing Gittin. We don't have the ability, unfortunately. We had one case of an elderly Rav who was initially vetted for writing Gittin, and then as he got older, he started taking certain liberties with respect to how he wrote Gittin. He started getting less careful in terms of it, and then we really had to discourage people from continuing to use this Rav. But we couldn't tell the Rav to stop. He wouldn't listen to us at that point in time, and he already had a name that was accepted. So, one of the more uncomfortable positions that we're in is that sometimes the Rabbanut HaRashit will turn to us and say, could you help us update our lists in terms of who we have in our list, whom we respect, whom maybe we shouldn't respect anymore. And it's a very uncomfortable situation to be in, but we have to be honest about those Mesader that we don't recognize, those Mesader where we have to do a case-by-case Drisha v'chakira. Now, Rav Moshe Feinstein writes that if you know that the Rav was an Orthodox rabbi and you don't otherwise have a reason to suspect that, a reason to assume that this person did it get improperly, like he doesn't have a reputation necessarily for being ma'aser gitti, for doing a coerced gittin of physical coercion and things of that sort. So Moshe writes, this is page 4, source Tes Zayin. He says, in the case that came before him, and this was a specific case where there was a question whether it was a get me'usa, because I think that the wife had taken some money from had gone to court, and the court had ruled that the husband was required to pay a certain amount of mizonos towards the wife, and only in order to get out of that obligation, because he wasn't fulfilling it, and they were putting him in jail, so he didn't pay, that he was willing to give a get. And Rav Moshe quoted from the various shitos that if it's onus ayidei davar acher, it's not a get, but maybe if it was shelo kedin, then it's a problem. But before he gets into that whole discussion, in the end he says they probably weren't mechayev more than what we would have been mechayev, and therefore it doesn't count as get musa. He found a way out of that. But he said that with the starting point, though, is that we do not assume that there's a problem with Gittin. If you look at the Shuva in Chelak Aleph Siman Kuf Lamed Zayin, Even Ezer, Yesh Ligor Be'ashoel, Sherotze Lahotzi Lazal Get Shenase Lifnei Kama Shonim, Lifnei Rav Shehorshe L'Sader Gittin. So he says, if I have a Rav who had certainly a reputation that he was known as a respectable Mesader Gittin, you don't start off with challenging his Gittin. Shebadei Chos V'Shalom Lanu, Lahara Lefakvik, Shem Lo Nase Kedin HaTorah, and there's a Cherem D'Rabbeinu Tam. A Cherem D'Rabbeinu Tam, if you were standing at the time of the get, and you were not Me'arer, you did not find the problem then, you're not allowed to find the problem afterwards. And in this case, he said that there's a Cherem D'Rabbeinu Tam, because the person who was asking the question was asking the question based on when he says the person who informed the shoel about the problem was somebody who was present at the get, and therefore that person violated the Cherem D'Rabbeinu Tam. However, there's a tshuva the Maharam in Lublin that was written around the time of the get Mibaina, in which he says that, and of course, his position in general is very contentious in that case. But he says certain things that are very mistaber. You weren't present at the get, and you had no way of knowing about it at the time. And you only find that afterwards. So when you find that afterwards, it's clearly a problem. So then, if something is clearly a problem, then obviously it needs to be flagged and it needs to be corrected. But Moshe points out that unless you know that, you certainly don't start off looking for problems with respect to somebody who's a respected Mesader Gittin. You start off with the assumption they did things properly. I've heard from certain respected Mesader Gittin that even if they are doing a get and they come up with shemos that are different from the way that the previous Mesader did the Shemos. If the previous Mesader was somebody who is well respected and was somebody with a good reputation, so then, assuming that it's in the ballpark, he just works with the assumption that the Shemos must have changed over time. That's all. The Shemos must have changed over time, and he doesn't look for problems. So of course, you have to have a chokmah to know when to apply that svara and when not to apply that svara. So if you look in source Yud Zayin, Igros Moshe Evaneser Chelik Dalet Siman Tes Zayin. So but Moshe writes, what about the following case, where it was written the Shtar Ksuva, okay, of this is a woman who wants to get married, and it's a question of mamzeris. Her mother was previously married, and it says in the Ksuva of her second marriage, Misarachta. It says Misarachta. So he says that if we're dealing with the person who performed the second wedding was a Rav who knew how to do Mesader Kiddushin, we're talking about Gittin la'achar Kiddushin, we're talking about Kiddushin la'achar Gittin, right? Of course, she'ino יודע, בטיב Gittin וקידושין, Kiddushin la'achar get, as the Maharsha says. So he says, that he wouldn't have written Misarachta if he didn't see that there was a shtar ptur. But he says that what if, however, we're dealing with somebody who is a chazan or a reverend. A lot of the weddings that took place in the Bronx, like in the early part of the 20th century, were done by reverends. And maybe he wouldn't know that the woman just told him that she was a grusha, and he wouldn't have asked for any information. So then he says, then you have to do a drisha v'chakira, and you have to find the Rav who was the original Mesader Gittin. That's kind of hard if you're going back 70 years, right? But if you have the ability to go back, so you go back. He says, but only if the only way that we knew that she had a first wedding altogether is because she told us, then we say a pesh yasu, a pesh itir. That's a difficult svara to rely upon because it's relatively kal avarir nowadays. If somebody was previously married, very often you can find wedding records and so forth. It goes back a long time, so maybe not. But Ramosha has shuvas about that as well. But let's assume that you knew the person was married. So he says, but let me tell you a general principle. And here is where you have a seeming discrepancy between what Ramosha says and what the Piskei Tshuva says. Ramosha says, whenever it's not clear that the Rav had the requisite Yiras Shemayim, but he had a name of an Orthodox rabbi, Kosher Le'agen, B'shvil Zeh. Let's say he wasn't recognized as a crackerjack Mesader Gittin. He was never specifically appointed in that position, like some of the things we've been talking about. But he says to make a woman an aguna for this, I wouldn't do it, because after all, he is an Orthodox rabbi. Kol shalek psul yadua. As long as I don't know, I don't know that the circumstances were such of Isoy or anything like that. Hareo becheskes kashrus v'gam kemen shenispashtu sidrei Gittin ba'olam rochol kusheyiyeh psul deraisa shelchen yesh lativli nasi. Says the worst thing might be that somebody didn't do something right on a D'Rabbanan level. So therefore, we can rely upon the fact that we have the kavnokis, we have the booklets that are out there in terms of how to do a get properly. So we assume that following the script is okay. I don't understand. I mean, you also have to work with the assumption that he has somebody who's a competent sofer, because that's often like the key to ensuring a good get. But that's what Ramosha Feinstein writes. On the other hand, the Piskei Tshuva, if you look in source Yud Tes on page 5, so when the Seder I get at the very beginning says we should only have a bucky deal with Gittin, says Miyam Shenispashtu Sidrei Gittin Machalitzos Bala Torah. He says the problem is when people have given out all of these scripts and all of these booklets that give you a question and answer script for the Sidrei Gittin, so then the Torah has gone out the window. Some people just use the booklet without knowing what they're doing. He says, woe upon the ears that hear such a thing. Even though the Mesadrim who put this together were daitim hayah l'shem shemayim, clearly they did this l'shem shemayim, but sounds on the Piskei Tshuva, oila znaim shkach shomos, that we wouldn't necessarily work with the assumption that everything really was fine just because we had the booklets out there. It's one of the reasons the Beis Din of America is very makpid not to distribute its get script. The get script is a very sacrosanct, carefully guarded document. It doesn't leave the environs of the Beis Din, even though you'll say, oh, but everyone can pick up a kavnoki. Good. If you know how to read a kavnoki properly, so you're already in pretty good shape. But if you're looking at the English script of the Beis Din of America, so you don't necessarily have to be such an expert just to go through the script, and therefore we want to prevent the pitfall. People are not so knowledgeable, just deciding, oh, I could be Mesader Gittin on my own, and they'll find some unsuspecting individual who's learning Safras to come and to write a get for them, and you might end up with very, very serious trouble along those lines. It's very interesting. He also has a tshuva in which he talks about somebody, a Rav, who was Maker when it came to Gerus. Maker when it came to Gerus, can we rely upon him when it comes to Gittin? So he quotes the Gemara in Bechoros, HaChoshed al HaKal ein HaChoshed al HaChamor. Just because he's a big Maker when it comes to Gerus, doesn't mean that he's going to be Mater Eishes Ish Lialma. Says, okay, one thing, you make somebody Jewish, okay, so you're not creating mamzerim per se. It's a mess, but not on the same level, not in the same order of magnitude as doing a get improperly. And also, he writes that unfortunately we don't have as good a tradition when it comes to the strict standards of Gerus, and Nimsu Gam Rabbanim Yirei Hashem Shemekilin Neshlo Mevurar Min Divrei HaPoskim Mefurish, because often it's not as Mefurish in the Divrei HaPoskim just how careful you need to be when it comes to Gerus. Unfortunately, we still suffer from that problem to a great degree. Bizman Hazeh Rachmana Litzlan. But when it comes to Gittin, he says if this Rav also does Gittin, the fact that his Gerus is shoddy is not a reason to suspect the get. In his case, the Aktaka was a little bit of a Reiss, because the father of the woman from whom the first get, she received the first get, and now she's married to somebody else. So he remembered that the way in which this Rav did it was he came to the hospital and he asked this man who was sick if he wants to give a get to his wife, and he said yes. And then the Rav had him had two witnesses sign on a piece of paper, and the piece of paper was not a get. So he thought that somehow he was counting just the stam niar bialma, just a blank piece of paper as a get. And Rav Moshe writes that probably the father, forgot over the years and exactly what happened, and it was probably a kisru tenu form. It was probably a pre-printed kisru tenu form, and then afterwards the get was written, and then this father forgot over the years, and now there was a child that was born from the second marriage, and he says that we don't have to worry that this Rav, since he was an Orthodox rabbi, the fact that he was Michael when it comes to Gerus is not a reason to suspect that he didn't do the get properly. And Rav Moshe throws it, and we're not even talking about allowing her to remarry on this basis. We're talking about the status of the child, so Safek Mamzer. Rav Moshe always said, hey, Safek Mamzer is haloneser, it's not osir anyway. Rav Moshe says that very often. He doesn't mean Safek Mamzer is mutter, because the Gemara says Safek Mamzer is osir, but Rav Moshe has a line, one of his chuvas, in which he says that whenever it's a noteh, whenever ruba lahakel, whenever you have a majority argument that it should be okay, so then we're not machmir on Safek Mamzer. So Safek Machmir is 50-50. Once it's already 70-30, so there's no halacha of Safek Mamzer. It seems there's a running theme in Rav Moshe's chuvas. Now, what if you have conservative get? What if you have a conservative get? So that already is a totally different ball of wax, and that's much, much more difficult to ever rely upon. There used to be, back in the day, there were a couple of rabbis in the world of the Jewish Theological Seminary who could sometimes be relied upon. Rav Soloveitchik apparently said, I didn't hear this directly, others in the room can correct me or clarify. Rav Soloveitchik apparently said that a get that was done by Boaz Cohen was considered to be okay. Why is Boaz Cohen considered to be okay? Because he was one of their official Mesader, and he always had Orthodox people, Orthodox Sofer, Orthodox Edim, who would oversee the process. I think Rav Elia Lichter would write for him. Rav Elia Lichter himself was qualified to be a Mesader get. If Rav Elia Lichter was involved in the process, he would see to it that it was written properly, that the Edim were kosher Edim, that the Edim Mesira were kosher Edim Mesira. So therefore you can rely upon that. I remember when I started working in the Beis Din world, we would sometimes get Gittin from a certain rabbi in Queens, who was a European rabbi actually, but he was in the conservative movement. He ran the Beis Din, the conservative Beis Din in Queens. His name was Solomon Faber, I believe. And Rav Elia Lichter would tell us if the get was written during a tkufa when he was writing the Gittin for Solomon Faber. If it was, he said, I can vouch for the get. If it wasn't, so, obviously you couldn't vouch for it. Then it would simply be a question, to what degree could you rely upon them? The problems with the conservative Gittin are multifold. One problem is that if when we look at the Shemos are often terrible. And sometimes there are other mistakes in the writing of the get itself that we see. But the biggest problems are the following two problems. Number one, that the Eidim are often not ksherim. The Eidim are not Shomei Shabbos, they're not ksherim. So you don't have kosher Eidim, so then all bets are off, and for sure you don't have a good get. The other thing is, at one point in time, they had a website. I think the Joint Bezdin, the conservative movement, whatever, they had a website about how they do their Gittin, and they threw in, amongst other things, and one of the things that we rely upon in order to bring about a get is get zikoy min abal. That we will do a get zikoy. The husband didn't even authorize the get. We'll just decide it was in his best interest for a get to be written. So you never know with any of their Gittin. It could be, forget, you read the get, it could be magnificent in terms of the Shemos and everything else, but it could be that it was a get zikoy min abal. Therefore, it's a non-get. It doesn't even get off the ground. I think I saw this on the website for a while, and then I looked at one point and it wasn't there anymore. Maybe somebody told them it was a good idea to take that part out. But really, the cat was out of the bag. So therefore, that's a serious issue. Now, what if, however, you're able to determine that no, there was a proper authorization from the rabbi? So, there was a certain rabbi in New Jersey who did a lot of Gittin for the conservative movement, and some of his Gittin, there will be a certain aid on the get. I heard this from, I think, Rav Jachter Shlita, that he had a relative who he knew to be a Shomei Shabbos, and if he signed on the get, so he knew he would only sign on the get if the other aid was also Shomei Shabbos. So if it wasn't a get Aidei Shliach, and they were Eidei Chasima, that means they also would have been the Eidei Mesira, and that way you know that the Eidei Mesira, the Chasima, Eidei Mesira, same people, were kosher Eidim, and if everything else in the get was fine, a sofer is only disqualified if he's mamish a min, and this person who apparently was not, he was personally Shomei Shabbos, he's not mamish a heretic, who was the Mesader and the sofer, so maybe there's room to be meko. Now this, of course, harkens to the sugya of called get sheyesh lav eid kuti pasul chutz migitei noshin, right? That if I have an eid kuti on a get, it's going to be pasul unless it's gitei noshin. Why is that? So the Gemara says it goes like the opinion of Rabbi Elazar that we only pasul kutim because they're not bekiyim b'tiktukei mitzvos. So if I have one eid kuti and one eid Yisrael, one kosher eid who signed, since eina eidim chosmin ala get zev shelo b'fnei zeh, since one has to see the other, so the kosher aid wouldn't have signed on the get. Okay, so when he signed second, we were there together. He wouldn't have signed on the get unless he ensured that the other get was also kosher. So he wanted to potentially make that argument. So it's interesting. Shulchan Aruch and Hilchos Avadim, Siman Reish Samach Zayin. That's where this halacha is actually brought. You wouldn't necessarily know where to look for it, right? So he says that okay, if you have a get isha, where you have Eid Echad Yisrael, Eid Echad Kuti, so it's going to be kosher, because the Eid Echad Yisrael is going to ensure that the Kuti is going to be a chaver. B'zman hazeh, however, we've automatically disqualified all the Kutim. Shakutim ka'ovdei kocham l'chol divrayim. So therefore, we can't apply this principle to the Kutim, but we can apply this principle to the Tzidukim. Nowadays, the Tzidukim would be like the old time Kutim, and if you had one Eid Echad Yisrael and one Eid Echad Tziduki, so then it's going to be okay. So comes along the Shach, and he quotes Moreno Arab Bitzalel Ashkenazi, Herich Ma'od Bezeh, Habe Bezeh, Umesik Shekaraim D'Mizman Azeh. He says, no, the Karaim nowadays, who are basically, it's another term for the Tzidukim, the Karaim nowadays, Kilkulu Ma'aseyim, Be'enam Kshem L'Shumedus. He says, no, there's no such thing as a kosher aid who is a Karai. So my question is, where do the conservative aid nowadays fit in? Let's say you determine that he is a Shomei Shabbos. Do you say just by virtue of the fact that he's non-Orthodox, affiliates non-Orthodox, he's in the category of either Kuti or Tziduki? Why is it that the Kutim were eventually pasul? Not because of a declaration that they were really Gerei Arayos, maybe in Gerei Tzedek, but either they were bowing down to a statue, a Demus Yona. That's what the Gemara says. Rabbi Meir wanted to pasul them for that reason, but then the Gemara says, no, they weren't pasul at that point in time. They were only pasul when it was determined that Leis Kan Shomei Torah, that there was nobody left, that there was Shomei Torah. And Rashi has a very interesting comment there. It's Gemara in Chulin Daf Vav Amud Aleph. He says, because the Dosh, Rabbi Meir, they didn't distance themselves from them, because they were used to interacting with them. Only later on, the days of Rabbi Ami, they weren't Shomei Torah anymore, so they separated from them. So I'm thinking that in terms of the conservative world, at one point in time, there really was like more of an interaction. There wasn't necessarily such an abyss, a distance between the traditional conservative, the monotheistic. They would talk to each other. There were big fights, and they would you read some of the literature in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, some of the takanos the conservative wanted to make, and how they were lambasted in the Orthodox world. We wouldn't lambast nowadays because we're not going to be going to them all together. We're not interacting with them all together. It's not like a question of, we think this is a bad idea. There was no havamina that it would be a good idea. That we've reached a point in which Ein Kan Shomei Torah, you look in the Kiruv world, it used to be in the traditional conservative world, there was a big, vast population that you would bring over to NCSY, Shabbatons, and so forth. It's a much vastly diminishing and shrinking world right now in terms of the interactions, and therefore it could very well be that nowadays we've reached the same stage with respect to the non-Orthodox community. But here it's possible, maybe we would differentiate between those who are serving in the rabbinic posts in that community, where clearly that they have strayed tremendously from any kind of halachic observance or acceptance of Torah min hashamayim and the like. Or you have a lay person who happens to be Shomer Shabbos and Shomer Mitzvos. I don't know. It's hard for me to understand how you would be a Shomer Torah and Shomer Mitzvos in that community. Maybe if you're dealing with a 95-year-old from the olden days, something like that, you would have to, scrutinize it very, very carefully. I remember at one point in time, we had a meeting with the head, I think he may still be around, with the head of the conservative Bezdin, this Mayor Revinu. He came in to the Bezdin of America. We wanted to make a deal. This is to show, this is a conversation that made sense you could still have 26, 27 years ago. The idea of having such a meeting now, I don't even think it would enter anybody's consciousness. But this is going back 25 years. So you could still have such a conversation. So we had a conversation, and we wanted to make a deal. Anytime somebody in the conservative movement comes into one of their conservative batidin, and they want to do a get, if they determine there was an Orthodox marriage, that they will send them to our Bezdin. If they determine it was an Orthodox marriage, they should send them to our Bezdin. And we almost had a deal on the table. We mamish almost had a deal on the table. Until they turned to us and they said, okay, but we want reciprocity. If somebody comes to you and you determine they had a conservative wedding, then you'll have to send them to us. So we said, no deal. The whole purpose of this exercise is to ensure that there be more kosher gittin, not less kosher gittin. We're not going to have kosher gittin at the expense of producing non-kosher gittin. So the whole deal was off the table. But we did it. But the fact that we had such a discussion, it says something about just the different stages of interaction. I think at this point in time, you wouldn't even have that degree of interaction.
Well, I don't want to take off into a tangent, but is that position because of Rav Hankin's shita or?
It's very likely in any particular conservative wedding that you may have had kosher eidim. You don't know. Every conservative wedding, a reform wedding, okay, maybe there's more of a presumption that it's 100% batum avuto. We don't automatically passel every single conservative wedding. We don't do that. I remember once I had a conversation with a leading posek. I won't say the name. A leading posek, and I said, what do we do with cases where we determine that it's a conservative get and it's complete and it doesn't have this cheskes kashrus because Rebelli Lichter didn't write it. It wasn't done for Boaz Cohen and the like, but it was only a conservative wedding in the first place. So how much Risha v'Chakira do we need to do? So he said, this posek said, Kibolo kakpoto. Said Kibolo kakpoto. But we never took the position Kibolo kakpoto. Kibolo, yes, it may have been Kibolo. Definitely not poto. There's no poto here, okay? Because the very strong kazak is the Gittin are garnished. The Kiddushin, as we said, the Taz said, it's much easier to effectuate a kosher Kiddushin. Kiddushin happens to have two kosher Eidim. The Kiddushin may have been good. Even according to Moshe, the Kiddushin may have been good. Forget Rav Henkin. Of course we want to, of course, be machmir the chatzkila like Rav Henkin. But sometimes even according to Rav Moshe, you need a get.
What year is this conversation that place that you just mentioned a moment ago?
What?
How long was the conversation?
How long was that conversation?
How long ago?
How long ago did that conversation take place? Probably about 15 years ago. Probably about 15 years ago. Okay. Now, it's interesting how Rav Moshe actually developed over time, because this is an undated tshuva. I'd like to say the year it was written. I don't know the year. It was written to Rav David Hollander, who was a long-time rabbi in the Rabbinical Council of America world in Brooklyn.
Before that, it was in the Mount Eden Jewish Center?
I don't remember the names of his shows. He was in Brooklyn. So this is a tshuva to him. So he writes here about a rabbi who's a conservative rabbi. He learned in the conservative seminary, and he was the Mesader Gittin for a get. There was a kosher sofer. There was one kosher aid, and he was the other aid on the get. Is the get kosher or not? If Moshe goes through hoops to find the way to be maksher the get, he says that since there were two kosher Eidei Mesira, the Eidei Mesira wouldn't have known that this guy, just because he was a conservative rabbi, was a apostle. In fact, he was Shomer Shabbos, but maybe not 100%, because it seems that he was Mizalzo Be'isra Hotzah B'Shabbos, came to carrying without an Erev. He wasn't so perfect. With respect to other aspects of Shabbos, he was better. So Rav Moshe said, I can't say for sure that he's kosher, but on the other hand, we weren't Mekabel Eidos. Maybe according to the Rambam, if somebody's an Apikuris, you don't have to be Mekabel Eidos. He goes back and forth, but he says that the biggest psul that he has is the fact that he took this position of being a rabbi for the conservative movement. So he says, but maybe there you can argue that it does not necessarily take away from his cheskas kashrus. Maybe he only did it for purposes of making a parnasa. Maybe he only did it for purposes of making a parnasa. He says that the efsha me'eza tam manasan lamdu sham kibul misras rabbi etzlam. Maybe for personal purposes, that's why he learned there and he took a position from them. But he still maintained his emunah b'Torah. But he says, but ulai isra cheskas kashrus shelen. Yesh svara. Loma the Kiddushin shematzu el shlom jam sheis shma mizul parnasa shemesigim achakak misas rabbi. Since there are Orthodox people who just do it for parnasa, lo isra because they pay more money. Lo isra cheskastan lachashtan mekofin. Therefore, you can't assume he's a kofir. In which case, you have to be mekabel edus. In which case, he wasn't necessarily pasul edus. And even though he was involved with minus, with the conservative movement, that's not an isra. That's only that he didn't stay far away from it. The hachek me'aleh drachecha is not an issa malchus, so therefore that also wouldn't necessarily automatically possibly, even though we know about that. And then he says you could be maksha with the Eidei Mesira. One of the three Eidei Mesira, because the two Eidei Mesira and the sofer, he says, could also count. But he says that nimsa echon mehem kol v'pasul doesn't apply. He says doesn't apply according to the Rif, because the ksherim didn't know that he was pasul. So what about mizuyach mitocho? He says, the machaber indicates the mizuyach mitocho and the edim psulim is only a psul d'Rabbanan, as opposed to the case where it's written shalol l'shma, where it's a chelik of the get, because he had ksherim who did it, so it's a chelik of the get. So that would be a psul. There's one day in the machaber, it's a psul d'Oraisa. This is less. The machaber for sure says it's only psul d'Rabbanan. The keman shurak shash psul d'Rabbanan. Samakti b'makom igun amash b'yarti sheyosim note shol nifsal rabbi yadayin leedus. So he says that I think there's more of an argument that he wasn't pasul leedus, it was just parnasa, and therefore I can't say that he's a kofar, etc., etc. And he says, and you know who agreed with me? Rav Yosef Eliyahu Henkin. Rav Henkin agreed with me on this psak. So it's obviously written early on. If he's still consulting with Rav Henkin, it's got to be no later than the 1960s. If he's quoting Rav Henkin. So, or 1970 or so at the latest. But in all of the subsequent shuvos of Rav Moshe B'dafka pointed to the fact that they are not only pasul for the fact that they affiliate with the conservative movement, but the argument they're doing it for parnasa makes it worse, because it makes them a mumma l'teyavon. Even Rava would agree that they're pasul edus. They would do this for money, so they could lie for money too. And therefore he says, there's no bigger pirsum v'chazak than the fact that they serve in this position, and for sure they would be pasul. So he writes that in Chelik Daled, Siman Yud Gimel, and Even Ezer. So it's very interesting that over time Rav Moshe soured, and I'd like to suggest, so my chiddush is, what's the reason? The reason is exactly this. The reason is that as we said, from the Gemara in Chulin, right? That there were no B'nai Torah. There ain't leis kan shomei Torah. When at a certain point in time there was shomei Torah, so therefore they were arguably still within the fold. You would find individuals who were shomei Shabbos, they could be within the fold, but then at a certain point in time, it became like the Kutim, where there were no shomei Torah anymore, where it was we were no longer regilim b'hem, like Rashi says in that sugya in Chulin, and already they're completely outside of the parasha. So I would submit that is an explanation for this turnaround that we find within Moshe's Chuvos, that it wasn't that he necessarily just a change of heart, it's a change of mitzias in terms of what they represented, a change of mitzias. They were completely, outside of the fold. Now, the last piece that I'd like to talk about in this context is, and this is probably the most difficult. I would just finish by saying Rav Gedaliah Dov Schwartz's policy was he would always look for grounds to pass a Kiddushin because he didn't have Eidim Ksherim like in a conservative wedding, but would never take into account, even as a sniff, in my experience, would never take into account, even as a sniff, the possibility of the kashrus of a conservative get. You're saying, it was never even a sniff. It was no kabolo kakpoto, that was not a sniff. But the only thing he would take into account is that he treated the get as a garnished, and it's just a question of the Kiddushin. So that's how I was trained. You focused on the Kiddushin to see if there were Eidim Sherim or not, but in terms of the get, there's nothing to rely upon. And certainly, when you don't even know whether they're doing, a get zika min abal, and they could be doing that, so how could you trust them with respect to anything? I hate to say it. I had one case where we had a conservative rabbi who had a congregant, and the congregant said, "I'll only do the get if my rabbi will officiate. Only do the get if my rabbi will officiate." So the rabbi happened to be a Shomei Shabbos, but we wouldn't, have him officiate, obviously. So we contacted the rabbi. We told him the situation. We said, "Can we do the get with you?" He said this fellow wanted to go to the rabbi to the shul and the sanctuary, the rabbi study, whatever. Can we go to your study and do the get? And you will read the script. We will have you read the script. The rabbi said, "Sure, very happy to do it, whatever." So he read the script and so forth. And we had a Mesader, proper Mesader get, who led the entire. It wasn't me, a proper Mesader get, who led the entire ceremony. And then it came time for the Eidim to be appointed. And when it came time for the Minoi of the Eidim, so the Mesader get, this was the only time during the entire procedure in which I saw the rabbi get annoyed, but it doesn't matter. So he turned it. So he said that to the husband, "You're going to appoint these Eidim, okay, to the exclusion of everyone else in the room." We don't normally say that. That's what he said. The rabbi knew exactly why it was being said, but so that's the only time. But Mamash set foot into the conservative synagogue, and we took care of it because pikuach nefesh, make sure there was a proper get. Now, the hardest case nowadays is when we talk about יודע, בטיב, גיטין, וקידושין, is to determine what to do. The woman was married, as we mentioned. There's no get, but she got a heter. She got a heter nisuin, and now she gets remarried, and now she comes to us, and she says, "Okay, time for me to get a get from my new husband, because it's not unusual to have recidivists when it comes to Gittin. The second marriage didn't work out either. She got a heter from some illegitimate bezdin to go and she had an Orthodox marriage. Got a heter from an illegitimate bezdin, get married a second time. She got married a second time. Whole thing was illegitimate. Does she require a get? Does she require a get altogether from the second husband? Does she require a get? So that's question number one. Does she require a get? So when this became, this started happening. It started happening in the aftermath of the Rachman Bezdin, you may recall. Unfortunately, after the Rachman Bezdin, there's also the emergence of the IBD, the International Bezdin, which unfortunately does pretty much the same thing. And then women get married, and now it's time for them to get divorced. Do they need a get? Do they not need a get? Right? You got to know. יודע, בטיב, Gittin, וקידושין. You got to know. Right? So so I asked this question both B'shaito when it first came up, Rav Gedaliah Dov Schwartz and Rav Hershel Shechter, Shlita. And they both answered exactly the same thing. They said, it's a Rashba at the end of Siman Yud Zayin. Rashba at the end of Siman Yud Zayin Eben Ezer, that you need a get. It's true. It is a Rashba, the end of Siman Yud Zayin, that you need a get in such a case. But not necessarily is it a. Does everybody agree with the Rashba? So we have to figure out. There are three different scenarios that are discussed in the poskim. You look at the end of Siman Yud Zayin. One scenario is a woman receives a heter from a legitimate bezdin. Receives a heter from a legitimate bezdin that she's allowed to get remarried, and then she gets married on that basis. So we say have ka'anusa, that she's considered to be like an anusa, right? And therefore she is muteris l'bayla rishon. So this is the Rashba. This is a Rashba who says that in this particular case, if it would be a legitimate bezdin, so says the Rashba, then she's muteris l'bayla rishon. If she's muteris l'bayla rishon, you know what that means? That means we're not requiring get from the second husband, because otherwise she wouldn't be muteris l'bayla rishon. So Rashba says if she would have received a legitimate heter from a bezdin, so then she would have to. So then she is an anusa, and she does not need a get from a second husband. She can even go back to the first husband if she wants to. She probably doesn't want to in most of our cases, right? But if it was a legitimate heter, a legitimate bezdin, not a legitimate heter, legitimate bezdin, they made a mistake. Legitimate bezdin made a mistake. So then it says the Rashba is legitimate bezdin made a mistake. So then she can go back to the first husband, and obviously by inference she doesn't require a get. But what? Right, because of we say in this particular case that because of the fact that she's an anusa, she can go back to now. What's the proof text of the Rashba? Proof text of the Rashba is the case of Michal, the daughter of Shol. The Shol Paskin, that Kol Mekadesh, Milva Pruta, Taita Milva, and therefore the Kiddushin of Michal to David, he said, was not a good Kiddushin, and therefore he gave her over to Palti ben Laish. How could she go back to David afterwards? So the answer is that because of the fact that she was relying upon her father, who was a Gadol Yisrael, who was the chief posek, Shalom Melech, he made a mistake, so therefore she was allowed to go back to David Melech. That's what the Rashba says. Everybody understands that she didn't do anything wrong, and she was relying upon a legitimate heter. But there's people might say that she got a get from David, and then she went back to him afterwards, and he's being Maxi Gushaso, right? Maybe they said that she got a get from David, then got another get from Palti, and then they'll say she's Maxi Gushaso. That's the whole sugya in Yevamos Staf Peiches Samad Beis. When we're worried about that, when do we say this principle of that a woman got married by mistake because Reiss who said that her husband died? So we say Gzeira Shema Yomu Girek Seven Asazeh. The name says Heishisish Yotza below get. But then at the end of the Gemara says that if she was only Mekudeshes to Sheni, she can go back. Why is that? So we say Reisha of the Yisura Kansura, Sefer the law of the Yisura Lo Kansura Rabbanon. It could be that it has to be coupled with the fact that she did something wrong. So we're going to impose a knas. So machlokas Rif and Rosh, whether you need both things. That there's the possibility people will say she received the get from the first one and then the second one, and then went back to the first one, plus that she did something wrong, or just that she did something wrong. So the Rif has the girsa of the Beis Yosef, and his Bedek points this out. He has the girsa of Ella at the end. That Ella, Reisha Dav the Yisura Kansua, Sefer the law of the Yisura Lo Kansua Ban. It's an Ella, so it all depends upon the Knas. So even if it would be a case of a Yavama who thought that her husband was dead and she married her brother-in-law, where nobody's going to think that, oh, well, she must have gotten a get from her husband and then she married the brother-in-law and now she's going back to her husband, when he turns out to be alive, because you can't do that. According to the Rif, where it's all about a knas, so if she wasn't careful, so it's still going to impose the knas. If I don't have the word Ella, which apparently the Rosh didn't have the word Ella, so the Rosh said it doesn't apply in this case, because you also need the possibility that people are going to say that Shema Yomu Girek Seven Asazeh. So that's a machlokas Mechaber and Ramah and Simon Kufn and Tes. Mechaber is Machmir, like the Girs of the Rif, and the Ramah is Mekel, like the gears of the Rosh. So if we understand like that, we understand that there has to be some sort of a knas involved, so we understand why the Rashba was so Mekel over here. Now, not everybody was so keen about this kula of the Rashba. The Taz. The Taz says that that's not what was what's going on over here, because in the case of Michal, we know what the Gemara says. The Gemara says that she was never Nivola. She was never Nivola to Palti altogether. He says. So therefore, nothing got off the ground. With respect to Michal. And he says that if you're going to say that Haraz Bezdin is considered to be an onus, and therefore in that there's nothing to so he says that's the reason why we're going to be Mekel, because it'll be like the case of Niskacha, where there was no Avera, so in that case we're going to be Mekel. So he says, and with that which we say that Haraz Bezdin is an onus and not a shogeg, so he says I don't think so. I think it's not quite an onus, because if it would be an onus, so why do we have a parhelim darash shel tzibur? Require a korban in makam onus. So Haraz Bezdin is obviously a shogeg. So shogeg is worse. There's a certain amount of negligence with respect to Haraz Bezdin, just like in the case where two Eidim say that your husband died and she gets married, so we say Haval al the Medak, she should have checked that more. She should have checked that more in this case as well. So not everybody agrees with this kula of the Rashba. Okay, but that's the Rashba's kula. Again, in the case where you had a ruling from a legitimate Bezdin. Case number two is the case where Isha sheniskacha v'tarsa v'sara shlo niskacha nises la'acher. She didn't get a ruling from a Bezdin. She just made a mistake on her own. We say no. Then for sure we're going to impose a knas upon you. Then for sure we're going to impose the knas, and she's going to for sure require a get from the second husband. So most of the poskim say that the Noda B'Yehuda has a tshuva about this, that if I have a situation where the woman did not receive a hara from a very reputable bezdin, she just received a hara from somebody who was out on the street, right? Some person out on the street, or some bezdin that did not have a good reputation, like what I've been discussing, bati din that are not mukarim. So then it falls into the category of tasa v'sava. So in such a case, a get would be required. So that's basically what they were alluding to when they said that according to the Rashba, because the Rashba was only mekel in case number one, not in case number two. Furthermore, the Beis Yosef brings another ruling of the Rashba, where in case number three, what's case number three? Case number three is not where the woman simply was made a mistake. She made a mistake in judgment that wasn't based on legitimate bezdin, but she knew what she was doing. She was amazing. Rashba talks about Rachel comes along and she says, I'm a penuya, but she knows that she's niskacha, she was niskacha the Reuven. She just didn't tell anybody. So in that case, says the Rashba that she needs a get, both from the first husband and from the second husband. And he says, but you know who disagrees with me? My Talmidim, what we would affectionately refer to as the Talmidei Rashba. Talmidei Rashba hold, in the case of Mesader, there's nothing to worry about. Nobody's going to think that, the first one gave her a get and the second one gave her a get, because they know very well that she was a mezida, that she was like a mezanis, like an adulterous woman. We don't require that the adulterer give her a get. Nobody ever heard of such a thing. The adulterer is going to give her a get. So she goes to a marriage ceremony with the adulterer. Who cares? She went to a marriage ceremony with the adulterer. It's just clear-cut adultery that she's a mezida, and therefore she does not require a get. So therefore, the Rashba holds that in case number one, where she received a mistaken heter from a legitimate bezdin, she doesn't require a get from the second husband. She can even go back to the first husband. If she made a mistake on her own, so then she does require a get. And if she was a mezida, she requires a get. So in our cases of the bezdin, it's not a recognized legitimate bezdin that gives a heter to a woman to remarry, according to the Rashba, she falls either in case in category number two, that she made a mistake, right, because it wasn't a legitimate bezdin, or she's a mezida. She's mezida. She should have known better that it's not a legitimate bezdin. She's well aware that the whole world doesn't recognize this particular bezdin, and she went to the bezdin anyway. It's a question of her awareness. If she was not so aware, so then she's in category number two. If she was aware, she's in category number three. But either way, in either category, according to the Rashba, she's going to require again. Now, what happens that the Chokmas Shlomo asks the question and says that, you know what, if she was a Mesader, so then he says that for sure, I don't think that she should, if she was a Mesader, he agrees with the Talmidei Rashba. If she was a Mesader, that she thinks that it would not be necessary for her to have again in the case of a Mesader, because of the fact that nobody's going to make a mistake. To think that, first of all, she's not going back to, we're not talking about going back to the first husband. Nobody's going to think that she was legitimately married to the second husband because of the fact that she was clearly a Mesader. And just like we say in Eishes Ish, this is in Siman Yud Zayin and Sif Aleph. It starts off, Eishes Ish B'klal Reiss Ve'en Kiddushin Tosim Ba, and it doesn't say anything about requiring a get midrabanan. So he says, we see from here that if a woman is just brazen enough to be an Eishes Ish, that starts living with another man as a husband and wife, that's muchach, it's lo by Kiddushin, afilu midrabanan. And he brings a couple of rayas that are not particularly good rayas because they only deal with cases where she had a Kiddushin as opposed to an Isuin afterwards. But he says that the idea is basically the same. Therefore, whenever you don't have a case where she was niseis beheter, we're not going to be worried about appearances. It's only when she was niseis beheter, people will think that there was a get from her first husband and from the second husband, worried she'll go back to the first husband, etc. So the question is, what do we do in the situation where we want to get a get from the second husband, but he's not forthcoming? He won't give a get. Is there any room to potentially be mekel in a situation when we have a machlokas haposkim as to whether she really requires a get or not? So we had a case about 8 years ago. We had a case about 8 years ago. Is the following scenario, crazy scenario. Cases like this: woman's married to first husband and he refuses to give her a get. She gets a heter from a rabbi who had a reputation not from either of these batidim. A rabbi from the Orthodox community, from the more mainstream Orthodox community per se, but unfortunately who had a reputation for being trigger happy when it came to giving heterim to women, and just had a sore spot for giving heterim to women. Let's leave it at that. And and he gave a heter based on the fact that she doesn't need a get because the husband did not have any interest in her. Didn't have any interest. He just showed he'd come home, read the newspaper, watch a game. I don't know. He just didn't show any interest in her. Not only did he not show any interest in her, but he was psychologically sad a lot and so forth. And he wasn't providing her with a good parnasa. He wasn't getting a good job and so forth. So he said, Kiddushin tos. So obviously, that's a joke. We wouldn't consider these to be grounds for Kiddushin tos. The fact that he wasn't interested in her, but they had a child together. How not interested in her could he be? So this isn't a case where he didn't have Ruas and Oshim, so she wasn't so happy with her marital life, like lots of other people. You go for therapy. It's not he wasn't happy-go-lucky all the time. How many happy-go-lucky people do we have all the time? That's not grounds for Kiddushin tos. So before she got married to husband number 2, there was a lot of pressure. When people found out about this heter from the rabbi, they turned to the rabbi and said that your reputation is in trouble. Your reputation is in trouble if this woman gets married based upon your heter. We want you to revoke the heter. And he wrote some sort of a letter to her, an email, I don't know what, saying that, you can't really rely upon my heter. And there's some machlokas, different accounts, as to whether he kind of whispered to her, I have to say this to satisfy the rabbis, but of course you can rely upon my heter. So then she received, she got married to husband number 2 with a rabbi who was a friend of rabbi number 1. So you got a little bit, questionable. And she goes off with marital life. And of course, marriage number 2 turns out to be an even bigger disaster than marriage number 1. And she desperately wants to get out of marriage number 2. And the husband in marriage number 2 says, no way, no how, I'm not giving her a get. But it turns out another piece of information, 2 other pieces of information. Number 1, in the meantime, husband number 1 died. Husband number 1 died. So we don't have to worry about her ever needing to receive a get anymore from husband number 1 because he's dead. Husband number 2 is still alive. You have a question. Even if their marriage wasn't valid to begin with, because she relied upon an illegitimate heter, maybe now that husband number 1 is dead, so husband number 2 is going to realize, now I have a chance for a legitimate marriage, so he was Baal L'Shem Kiddushin, at that point in time, maybe, so nobody was worried about that. Okay, fine. So we'll leave out that consideration. Nobody was worried. Everyone assumes Shainu said that he had in mind the original Kiddushin. He was relying upon himself. Okay. But then the other thing that turned up, and this is what really was the final nail in the coffin of the marriage, is that it turns out that he had been abusing her daughter. Abusing her daughter, he had actually raped, sexually molested her daughter. And as soon as the mother found out about it, not only did she walk out of the marriage, but she and her daughter together reported him to the criminal authorities that he molested her prior to the marriage. So the Shaila came to Rav Asher Weiss. When Rav Asher Weiss wrote a tshuva to the Chaveri Bezdin America on this particular case, this is going back 8 years ago. At the time, there was a request not to publicize it. I assume 8 years later, come on. Sorry, so the tshuva goes like this: that you have the question mark that maybe in a Mesader case that clearly he says that she wasn't relying upon a bezdin musmach. This wasn't a bezdin musmach. This wasn't a bezdin she'ino musmach. This was nothing. He said Alpha Riverbay Rivovos Anoshim are not interested in their wives. Says tens of thousands of marriages, the wives complain that the husbands don't pay enough attention to them. So we're gonna, nullify, 90% of marriages. Says, come on, out of your mind, basically. And he says that with respect to whether the second marriage was good, so he said clearly it doesn't fall into the heter of the Rashba. That there was a legitimate heter from illegitimate heter from a legitimate bezdin. Doesn't fall into that category. In terms of, so it's either in category number 2, which the Rashba, clearly holds that a get would be required, right? But he says that she made a mistake in relying upon the original psak that wasn't a good psak. But he says it wasn't a mistake because Lamaisa, she knew that this was trouble, and she even got a letter from the original rabbi saying, "Don't rely upon this." Oh, okay, maybe she heard from him not to rely. He said she's basically a Mesader. You have Rabbi Akiva Eger and others who say Mesader case, totally different story. Even the Chazon Ish says that if it's in Siman Sama Gimel, Sifkat and Yugimel, Chazon Ish says also Mesader case, you don't have to worry that people are going to assume that there was a proper get and so forth. Assume that you need that criterion as well. It's not just a question of knas, because otherwise every Shezinsa would require a get from the adulterer. So therefore you have that to rely upon. I wouldn't rely upon that alone, because that's a machlokes between the Rashba and the Talmidei Rashba. Even the Chazon Ish says, and this is also of the Nezer Kodesh, the Moshe Rosen says the same thing as well. That if I had a situation where the woman had moved to a different town altogether, and people don't know that she was previously married to somebody else and it didn't end with a get, even if she's a Mesader, so in that particular case we're going to be more machmir to require a get because of appearances. That's a big question as to whether we say in general that we have to. Nezer B'Kodesh said in general we have to be worried that maybe there really was something. And therefore, in that case, maybe a get really would be required. But here, everybody knew the circumstances, so he said, I wouldn't rely upon these considerations alone. But bear in mind, we're only dealing with a get midrabanan. So once we're only dealing with the get midrabanan, and he says that the second marriage was so clearly problematic. Wait, we're going to be machmir to require a get with respect to the second marriage when the heter for the first marriage, number 1, was so clearly a faulty heter, and number 2, when the second marriage has one of those very, very rare cases, where it looks like you have a very legitimate Kiddushin Torah's argument. Because what woman in her right mind would ever want to get married to a man if she knew that he had molested her daughter prior to the wedding? No woman would do that. Since nobody has such little self-respect that if they knew there was molestation of their daughter, they would still want to marry this man. So therefore, if you throw that together into the equation, that I wouldn't be matir otherwise, but given that it's only a get requirement midrabanan, and there's strong grounds to say that even if The first, I otherwise would have required a get. Or even if I was only dealing with a second marriage in a vacuum, and it wasn't a question of the fact that she was still married to the first husband, I would still it would still not be a valid marriage for that reason. So therefore he said, I'm prepared to be mekel, but only if I can find some other major posek who is also prepared to be mekel, and one other major posek who agreed to be mekel in this case was anybody? The first Shechter Shlita. Okay, so therefore we had the second voice of approval, and in that particular case they were mekel. But as a general rule, we do have to worry. We have a lot of these cases where somebody shows up to the Beis Din, and a woman shows up and she wants to get a get from her second husband, and it turns out she never got a get from the first husband. And you have the cases where they both. How could an Orthodox rabbi have married her the second time around? The answer is it wasn't an Orthodox rabbi. It was some other rabbi. Where you say she was a Mesader, she was a Tasa, but she still requires a get from the second husband. But of course she requires a get from the first husband as well. Sometimes the first wedding was Orthodox. Sometimes it was conservative as well. Sometimes it's a question as to whether the first marriage was legitimate, whether Eidim Shem, whether not Eidim Shem. So Shari Deya, okay, the Shari Deya has a very, very interesting chumrah that he bases upon a Gemara in Gittin on Daf, I think Pei Beis, Summon Beis, that says that in order for a get to be minimally valid, this is the machlokes of Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim regarding an Isha who only receives a get that says Hareyat Megoreshes Mimeni. She's only Isha Grusha Me'isha Lo Yikachu. So that is a minimally acceptable get for purposes of her being psul lakuna. Counts as reach get. So reach get midaraisa. It's a shagasari like explain it. But we pass them like the chacham. It's not otherwise a get. It's not otherwise a get. Why? Because in order to be a get, it has to be matir her to somebody. It has to be matir her to somebody. In order for it to be a get, to be anything, to be a real get, it has to be matir her to somebody. So says the Sharidea that you're not being matir her to if the second husband is going to give her a get, so you're not being matir her to anybody because the first marriage was still in effect, and therefore she is not being muteris to anybody more than she would have been muteris to beforehand. Only if the first husband gives her a get, so then arguably before I unravel the second get, she's at least becoming muteris now for the first time to the second husband. But there's nothing new she's being muteris to if you start off with a second husband. So there's an actual order that you should do the gittin. So when you are doing these gittin the chumrah, you should always do the get from the first marriage before you do the get from the second marriage. Now there's the case I included in the materials of the Tzitz Eliezer, of a case where, crazy case, a man went to Beis Din, he showed up, and he with a woman who was not his wife. And he had the Beis Din do a full get, said, this is my wife, and they did the get, and they came home with the p'tur, came, I don't know, to home or to the woman's house, who he was married to, not clear, but he comes to her, to his real wife, and he says, okay, here's your p'tur. And she said, wow, I didn't have to do anything? He said, yeah, that's the way it works. I thought that I'm supposed to be there. I said, nah, nowadays, it's not, they don't require it anymore. And she decided, okay, I'm going to go with this. And she went and she found another man to marry. The rabbi, the Orthodox rabbi, says, show me your Tudas Gerushin. Yeah, here's my Tudas Gerushin, from respected, Beis Din, Rabbanut, whatever. So they marry her off, and now she has a child, unfortunately. She's pregnant at the time. She's about to have a child. And the situation is found out about. And the Beis Din Paskin, the Teitse Mizeh, that she has to get a get from the first husband, the second husband. The child, unfortunately, is going to be a mamzer. And there was some well-meaning Rav who tried to find various heterim, this, that, the other thing. I don't know what the heterim were. But so he wrote to Tzitz Eliezer. Tzitz Eliezer says, you're a tzaddik, you're a chassid. It's wonderful, you're looking for all these heterim, but unfortunately, there are none. There are no heterim in this particular case. This was a woman who herself was certainly a mezida. Certainly, we have to be kones her. He did not go along with the pshat. He said, for sure, in this case, where it looks to the outside world that she really did receive a get, so we have to be machmir. to require a get from the second husband as well, because she certainly looks like an Eishes Ishli Alma, so require a get from both husbands, and unfortunately the child is to be a mamzer, and the woman was not happy about it. Obviously, it's a very sad, tragic situation. The first husband came around, but the first husband came around much later than the second husband, because he said, hey, I went to a get already. I brought a different woman to the best, who cares? They didn't stop me. And she and the woman said, I didn't know any better. So so Tzitz Eliezer said, yes, you did know better. That's why you asked your husband the question. You should have asked him. And when it was time for you to get married, you should have gone to the Rav Mesader and said, I didn't receive this get myself. My husband told me it was okay. I just want to make sure it's okay, but you didn't say that. So therefore, you don't have clean hands over here. But in any event, in that case, I noticed, if you look at the fact pattern of the case, in the Tzitz Eliezer, the second husband gave her the get first, and then the first husband, and he wasn't makbid on the Seder. He wasn't makbid on the Seder. It's not miyakev. The Seder's not miyakev. He has a very, very interesting suggestion that when you write the get from the second husband, you should write the kuchasi rather than writing insisi, because it's not really the right to say the kuchasi. Probably, it's not our practice. It's not our practice. When we write a get from the second marriage, we don't write the kuchasi. We still write insisi. And probably part of it is that it's sometimes hard to tell which which is the really valid marriage. Is the first marriage or the second? Could be the second marriage is more valid than the first marriage, particularly if you're dealing with conservative Gittin, which is usually the case when you have multiple marriages. If the first marriage was indeed Orthodox and the second one was Reform or something like that, then Taka, the Shiloh would come up, but we don't mess around with the signon of the get, and it's probably not really Torah per se anyway, but that's just sort of an interesting sidelight that I wanted to point out. So in terms of the question really that the Maharsha had raised, or this feature of the necessary expertise raised by the Maharsha, יודע, בטיב, גיטין וקידושין, the idea of Kiddushin following Gittin. So as we've seen, that there are really three very important aspects that relate to Hilchos Gittin that Mesader Kiddushin has to be aware of and really can't do on his own without proper consultation with those who have been trained in the area of Gittin. Number one, if there was a get, whether the get was properly kosher. Number two, if there was a heter without a get, whether it's a proper heter, in fact there is no tzorech for a get. And when to make a determination that when a woman errs and gets involved with a new marriage relationship because of some sort of error or some type of a mistake in psak, when is there a necessity for her to receive a get from the second husband under those circumstances? And we will stop here. Okay.
Monday? Monday at 3.
Monday?